Well, it's just so depressing to be here again, watching, men, women, and children being slaughtered in Gaza once again, and in the West Bank. As we're speaking today, it's reported that 10 people have been killed in the West Bank by Israeli occupation forces, and one person in Lebanon is reported to have been killed by Israeli shelling. And so it's such a familiar story. We've seen it before. We saw it in 2014 when Israel slaughtered 2,200 people in Gaza. But I want to take a second to reflect on something that Ahmed Aburtema wrote for us at the Electronic Intifada. Ahmed Aburtema is one of the founders of the Great March of Return, the mass movement in Gaza that was launched in March 2018, which mobilized tens of thousands of people to go to the border unarmed to demonstrate for their rights, where they were mercilessly gunned down by Israeli military snipers. And he wrote an article called "This Time It's Different." And what he's saying is that the spirit in Gaza, they're terrified, of course. They're watching their loved ones be killed. But he talks about, as others do, a strong support for the resistance, that people were demanding that the resistance act. And that spirit is, for the first time in many years, taking place across historic Palestine at the same time. So while Gaza is resisting and fighting for all Palestinians, and that's something that's different, that this war was not sparked by an incident in or around Gaza, but was launched in defense of Jerusalem. And at the same time, we see an uprising across the West Bank. We see Palestinians within Israel rising up, protesting, confronting Israeli police, burning police stations, hoisting the Palestinian flag. And so there's a spirit of unity, of purpose among Palestinians that many have not felt in many years. And I think there's another significant element to this that cannot be understated. Less than a year ago, Jared Kushner and the Trump administration brokered the so-called Abraham Accords, where Israel signed these so-called peace deals with US-backed client regimes, including the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, and tacitly, effectively, Saudi Arabia, not yet formally, but for all practical purposes, with Saudi Arabia. And this marriage between, the Zionist apartheid regime and the US-backed Gulf dictatorships was celebrated over what they thought was the dead body of the Palestinian cause. They thought that the Palestinian issue had been buried, that the Palestinians were completely sidelined and powerless, and the Israelis were victorious. So these Gulf tyrants bet on Israel and bet on Zionism. They thought that was the wave of the future. So this uprising by Palestinians, this resistance, really buries those Gulf tyrants and buries their so-called Abraham Accords, and shows that Palestine remains the central issue in the region. And there was also a massive miscalculation on the part of Israel, because emboldened by the so-called Abraham Accords, emboldened by the unconditional support from the Trump-Biden administration. That's what I'm going to call it, the Trump-Biden administration, because there really is no difference. It's just total continuity. They thought that we can now push ahead with the ethnic cleansing of Sheikh Jarrah in Jerusalem. We can push ahead with the ethnic cleansing in Silwan. We can push ahead with accelerating land theft and settlement construction in the West Bank. And they miscalculated. They did not think that Hamas and the other resistance factions would dare to respond militarily from Gaza to Israel's aggression in Jerusalem. That was a big miscalculation on Israel's part. And I think what we've seen in the last few days, and you can read this from the Israeli analysts, is an element of strategic surprise that Hamas was able to inflict on Israel, where they were able to launch more rockets with more power and more range than ever before, which shows that the Israeli propaganda in 2014, that we dealt Hamas a severe blow, we reduced their capacity, we contained them, is total nonsense. That the resistance has actually got stronger. They have learned from their experience, and they are now able to substantially defeat the Iron Dome, or the Iron Colander, as some people call it, or the Paper Dome missile defense system that Barack Obama was so proud of funding. And we see that tactically and strategically, Hamas and the Palestinian resistance have learned and applied a lot of the lessons that the Lebanese resistance learned in 2006 from its defeat, it's the defeat it inflicted on Israel then. And Israel is now, as we speak, in kind of a quagmire, so to speak. They can't defeat Hamas. They can't really invade Gaza. The only thing they would achieve by that is massacring more men, women, and children. But they're not going to be able to really substantially touch the capabilities of the resistance. And indeed, they would be even more vulnerable if they went in to Gaza for a major ground attack. And yet Israel is looking for some kind of something they can proclaim as a victory, to say, oh, we won, and now we're going home. And they can't do it. Every time Israel launches one of these all-out campaigns of bombing, they end it achieving nothing. And so it's it breaks the heart, it breaks the spirit to see the death and destruction that Israel is once again knowingly and deliberately inflicting on Palestinians. At the same time, I take strength from the fact that people in Gaza are the ones telling us we know what we signed up for, and we support this fight. We support resistance because it's the only way that we can survive and win our liberation.
Ronnie, I know you have to leave us pretty soon, at least temporarily. So I wanted to ask you for any thoughts you have right now.
I mean, I agree with much of what Ali said. And yes, the destruction that we're witnessing is horrible to see. But, I also have to say there's something inspiring about what I'm watching as well. And I know that's an odd thing to say when Gaza's being so horrifically and relentlessly bombed. We've seen that, that at least 30 children have been killed, if not more, in Gaza in the last few days. And Israel is very blatantly and openly targeting civilian infrastructure. The Gaza Health Ministry says at least 40% of the casualties so far have been women and children. So people should understand this as a bombing campaign against children. That's essentially what's taking place right now. That said, the reason I see something somewhat inspiring taking place right now is I can't remember a time, at least not in recent memory, not in the last decade, where there has been this kind of, you have to give Israel credit for somewhat unifying the region, if not briefly. After the last decade of Arab Spring and all these, dirty wars across the region, with Syria, this escalation with Iran, this sectarian fighting across the Middle East, I've been hearing from a lot of friends across the region, across sectarian lines, and they're all watching what they're seeing in horror. And they've all unified around the Palestinian cause, at least for now. People from Iraq, people from Syria. I mean, people from, even people I've spoken to who in recent years have started to come along or around to the idea of, well, maybe we should normalize with Israel. Maybe it's, maybe the Palestinian fight isn't our fight. But what they're watching right now is they're watching